Now, some mixed signals in this next piece coming from Microsoft with regards to their Scorpio project and VR. So it was believed that Scorpio would kind of be their answer, Microsoft's answer to virtual reality. They focused on that aspect at E3, saying, look, this was going to be the hardware capable of powering virtual reality devices. All right. Phil Spector was pressed on that. And his exact quote was, when they asked him, "We are very focused on console games and what console gamers want. And I see VR as something different." So, of course, that set the virtual reality world afire with rumor and speculation that maybe it isn't going to be their answer to virtual reality. That while it's capable of it, ultimately they may not deliver that with it. So it's going to be interesting to keep an eye on that. Is Microsoft going to join VR at some point? Because the other piece of the puzzle they've never even talked about, right, is HMD. Fine, they have the ability to power VR, but what exactly are they powering? And there's rumors there, there's speculation, possibly acquisition, possibly partnership, possibly their own. We just don't know yet. Concrete, we can't say. So it'll be interesting to kind of follow that and see which way they go. Now, the next thing I wanted to talk about isn't so much as of a news piece as it is, just a bit of an opinion on indie devs. And I've had a lot of comments that question my stance on indie devs, like I'm anti-indie dev, which absolutely couldn't be further from the truth. I am very much pro-indie dev. Again, it's all about the game. That's all it should ever be about, is the game. Whether it's a AAA publisher or an indie dev. Does that sometimes mean I hold indie devs to a higher standard? Absolutely, because I know historically what indie devs have managed with much fewer resources, right? I was part of that whole arcade generation. I am Gen X. That's who I am, right? I'm a guy born in the 70s, raised in the 80s and 90s. Like, that's the reality of it. I was there for the whole arcade revolution, the start of the console revolution. I've seen this played out time and time and time again. In the beginning, arcade games and console games were literally created by a single programmer. Exactly like today's indie devs. That's the size of the average programming group. It was one. As the 80s transpired, as you got to the mid and second half of the 80s, those team sizes started growing. You'd have somebody who did the music, somebody who did the programming. In fact, if you look at any of the 8-bit computers of the day, and even the 16-bits like the Amigas and the Ataris, and look at the game credits, what you're mostly going to see is game program by, music by. It was a two-person effort generally. It's when you get into the 90s that you start building that traditional AAA publisher model that we see now, where a game dev group like an Electronic Arts easily, if you count quality assurance, which you probably should, you've got hundreds of people involved in a game. You have multiple programmers that handle just subsets of a game. Like, you might have a small group that handles the user interface, another that handles game and AI logic, quite a few people that deal with graphics, but one might be concept art, one might be creating polygons, etc. So where have we seen this cycle play out before? Well, throughout the whole time, because while that was taking place, we didn't call them indie devs. We called them shareware authors, right? Same thing. They were the indie devs of the time. They went back to that 1-2 person model. Jeff Vogel is a guy that I've talked about before. Perfect example. To this day, other than some assistance on art, he creates his games on spiderweb software by himself. And he's been doing that for almost 3 decades now. Since the early 90s, he's been creating RPGs that are based on the CRPGs that we enjoyed in the 80s. That model, turn-based, etc., right? And look at Doom. id Software didn't start out as a AAA publisher. They were a shareware company, i.e. an indie company. They were known back in the day for Commander Keen, which was a 2D platformer that was offered via shareware. In fact, the original release of Doom was a shareware release. You got, I think it was one episode or a few levels, and then if you purchased that shareware game, it would open up the rest of Doom for you. So far from being anti-indie, absolutely not. I just have feelings about early access in general, and it's AAA publishers that tend to be able to deliver because they have the experience. They can deliver on a promise. Brian Fargo of Wasteland 2, I supported that Kickstarter because he has a history of completing products and making sure projects went over the finish line. And every once in a while, I will go with somebody that doesn't necessarily have a lot of experience if I feel the scope is achievable. If I start seeing stuff like Starbound, where there's scope creep to such an extent that they can't even release their first full, stable, comprehensive version of their vision 3 years later, that's when I get nervous, right? And where I'm going to tie that into virtual reality is that's what we're going to see. That's the beauty of all of this, is we are going to be seeing indie authors developing stuff for VR that in some cases, where shareware and indie authors for 2D, 3D games, they kind of kept the spirit of those older genres alive. You could argue that at the beginning of the 2000s, RPGs were almost dead if it wasn't for some of those indie titles, right? Well, we're going to see the same thing in VR. We may see a AAA publisher being completely wary and nervous about doing an adventure game in VR, right? But an indie dev studio might not have that same degree of nervousness, right? Because they don't have shareholders to worry about. And sometimes naivety is a good thing, because the younger you are, the less you kind of know about what your limitations. So if you've got a young indie dev out there, I mean, who knows? He could develop, or she could develop, that whole new awesome VR thing that we just haven't experienced yet. So no, I think it's a fantastic thing, and I think indie authors are going to be instrumental, probably the most important component of virtual reality moving forward, now that we have a lot of the big players backing the technology, and still a lot more to go, and the software. All right, guys, that's it for today's news video. So next one I'm going to do is basically a history, virtual reality, just kind of a side video. There's some really cool stuff in there, like the Sensorama. So that'll be in that video, and the Revive video. Look for that as well, and the gaming stuff as soon as I get that open broadcaster crap sorted. All right, guys, as always.